All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Urban Women and China's Demographic Crisis. I'm Emily Baum, and this webinar has been brought to you by the Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine. So recently, the Chinese government announced that married couples could have up to 3 children, a striking reversal from the notorious one-child policy, which was in effect from 1980 up until just about 5 years ago. Now, a few months after this announcement was made, the Chinese government also declared that it would seek to restrict access to abortions for non-medical purposes. What accounted for these rapid changes? Well, a lot of it has to do with major declines in China's birth rate, which is far below the level needed to maintain its population, and also the lowest birth rate recorded since the 1960s. The situation has become so pressing, in fact, that many people have begun to refer to it as a demographic crisis. Now, there are many explanations to account for why China is facing this crisis, but some scholars and pundits have focused their attention on urban women, specifically the fact that they are seeking to delay marriage and childbirth or simply choosing to forgo having children altogether. Today, I am lucky to be joined by 2 experts, an historian and a demographer, who are going to be giving further context to this perspective. Each of them will speak for approximately 10 minutes before we'll return for a moderated discussion and finally an audience Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In total, this webinar is going to last for about an hour, and if you can't stay until the end, we will send you a link to the recording in a couple of days. So for now, let me introduce our speakers. Speaking first will be Dr. Sarah Mellors Rodriguez, who is an assistant professor of history at Missouri State University and an esteemed graduate of the history PhD program at UC Irvine. Her first book, titled Reproductive Realities, Birth Control and Abortion in Modern China, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. She's also published articles in venues like East Asian Science, Technology, and Medicine, and she currently serves as the book review editor for the journal 20th-Century China. Speaking second will be Dr. Wang Feng, who is a professor of sociology and also my esteemed colleague here at UC Irvine. Professor Wang has far too many awards and distinctions to name, but in brief, he is the author, editor of 6 books, including most recently the book Convergence to Very Low Fertility in East Asia, Processes, Causes, and Implications, which was just published by Springer Press in 2019. He's also a very sought-after commentator, and he recently published an op-ed in the New York Times on China's 3-child policy. So without any further ado, I will turn the stage over to Sarah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sounds good.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now. Alrighty, so obviously I'm a historian and my research focuses on the history of abortion and birth control in China from the early 20th century to the present. And in particular, I focus on how women experienced and navigated China's shifting fertility policies. So to give us a little bit of background information for framing the current demographic crisis, it's useful to know that in the mid-19th century, the Qing dynasty, which was the last dynasty in China, faced mounting internal and external threats to its rule. Dissatisfied with this state of trade relations, the British launched the Opium Wars, which opened up China to more imperialist advances and eventually led to the fall of the Qing dynasty. Just going to give us a brief timeline. So the dynasty falls in 1911. In 1912, the Nationalist Party establishes the Republic of China. Beginning in the teens and early 1920s, eugenic discourses, which have been circulating all over the world at this point, begin filtering into China, and elites and intellectuals become increasingly concerned about how they can save the nation through individual health. In 1922, the American birth control pioneer, Margaret Sanger, visits China and further fuels this kind of elite preoccupation with saving the nation by improving the so-called quality of the population. At this time, while sterilization and abortion were technically prohibited, contraception was neither explicitly endorsed nor banned at the national level. In reality, although there were very few safe or effective options, a wide range of contraceptive and abortive medicines were available in the medical marketplace. To give you some examples, here are some ads from the 1920s and 30s for spermicidal pessaries, condoms, and various other early birth control devices. So abortion, though, appears to have been the most common form of fertility regulation, at least based on the historical record. And the primary reasons I've come up with for why people were using contraceptives or even undergoing abortion was due to namely poverty, not wanting an affair to be exposed, not wanting evidence of premarital sex to be exposed because that would have been taboo, or fearing losing one's job due to pregnancy. And although women from all walks of life, urban women from all walks of life would have been practicing birth control in certain situations or undergoing abortions, a majority of the ones that we know about are working class women who ran into legal trouble. Immediately after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the government severely limited access to birth control because a large population was seen as critical for enhancing the workforce and strengthening the economy. So following the Soviet model, because this is the time when China is really kind of following in the footsteps of Big Brother, Chinese women are encouraged to have as many children as possible. And the government even provides rewards for women who have the most children. That idea is nicely captured by this propaganda poster from 1954. Dad goes to work, we go to school, we see this happy, beautiful housewife with her numerous children who are going off to become, the new leaders of China while mom stays at home. By the mid-1950s, though, census results revealed that grain production could not keep pace with population growth. And there was also this growing desire to mobilize women's labor instead of having women stay inside the home. So this all leads to a gradual loosening of restrictions on contraceptives, abortions, and sterilizations, and the first national campaign, the first organized national campaign to promote family planning. Here on the screen, you can see to the left, I have pictures of some of the propaganda, or not propaganda, more like health and hygiene guides that were produced by the government. This is an example in the middle of a poster that would have been posted in factories and dorms and health clinics, teaching people how to use condoms. And this item on the right is actually a calendar for coordinating a woman's intercourse with her menstrual cycle to reduce the likelihood of pregnancy. And while this is all well and good, the results of this initial and very brief movement were highly uneven, with urban people and party cadres having much better access to these sorts of services and medicines than their rural counterparts. In 1957, intellectuals began calling for more attention to birth control, and they started criticizing the government's natalism, but they were soon silenced. In 1958, the Communist Party launched the Great Leap Forward, which is a campaign to enact rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization that resulted in approximately 30 million deaths in a mere 3 years, mostly due to man-made famine. From this we can see, and this is the only graph I'll use because I'm a historian, we don't use graphs. I'm kidding. Here we can see that China has a very high birth rate in the early 1950s. It dips down below the death rate during the Great Leap Forward, this is the only time that happens. And then immediately in the wake of the famine, the birth rate starts to spike again. So in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, it becomes even more urgent to enact some form of family planning. So state authorities begin encouraging what's called late marriage or delayed marriage, wanhun, to shorten the time in which individuals are able to reproduce, because the assumption is, or there's two key assumptions. One, that people only reproduce within marriage, and that basically as soon as they get married, they're going to start having babies. And that, so if you can shorten the amount of time in which people are fertile, they won't have as many babies during marriage. This movement also dovetails with an increased emphasis on getting women into the workplace. And so propaganda from this time emphasizes all of the possibilities available to women if they delay marriage. They can be, scientists, they can be agricultural workers, they can be industrial workers. And that theme continues onward up through the present, actually. So in 1966, all of this is still happening, but Mao launches the Cultural Revolution, and that's a political movement intended to destroy the ossifying bureaucracy and bureaucratic class, and purge the party state of capitalist roaders. And if you know anything about the Cultural Revolution, it's of course a highly disruptive period. And yet, birth planning, as it's known in China, instead of family planning, birth planning propaganda increases steadily from the late 1960s, from about 1968 onward. Throughout the 1970s, the state incrementally tightens restrictions on births, yet these policies are extremely uneven. So for example, in many cases, married urbanites are being encouraged and later forced to engage in family planning or birth planning, whereas unmarried rural couples, and there's increasingly large numbers of unmarried rural couples during this time, are being punished for practicing birth control and are not being given access to it. So underlying all of the state policy at this point is the belief that the only way to improve the economy and to improve the standard of living is through drastically limiting births. So the state first encourages people to just have 3 children under the later longer, fewer policy. Then it shifts to 2 children with the 1 is best, 2 at most policy. And then eventually the notorious 1-child policy, which of course limits families to 1 child, is implemented in 1979. Here are some examples of the kind of propaganda that would have been used all through the 60s, except for at the height of the Cultural Revolution, and definitely through the 70s. So here we have people learning about birth planning. We have young women, presumably young married women, because they were the focus of state efforts to control fertility. So we have these young married women learning from their teacher about how to plan their births. A system of punishments and rewards is introduced and used to enforce the policy, with 1-child families being given privileged access to housing, while punishments for violating the policy range from fines to mandatory abortion and sterilization. The kind of logic behind this can be seen through propaganda posters of this sort, which basically reinforce the idea that in order to have a high standard of living, to have rapid industrialization, China needs to have a very low birth rate. And also, I included this chubby little baby because it's so cute and chubby, but the idea being that China's children will be stronger and healthier along with the strong and healthy economy if there are fewer births. In 1984, though, restrictions end up being relaxed. Restrictions on births are relaxed in some places in response to widespread rural resistance. After that, only about 1/3 of the population continued to fall under the 1-child policy, and yet the original policy name, the 1-child policy, endures. In 2016, as was mentioned in the introduction, in response to the steeply declining birth rate, the 1-child policy was formally replaced with the 2-child policy, and then in 2021, so this year, the policy was again relaxed and a 3-child policy was enacted. With more than 18% of the population over 60, the central government is now encouraging larger families to support the country's graying population and supplement the dwindling workforce. But all throughout the 20th century and up through the present, it's really women who have borne the brunt of these changing policies. The obsession with increasing and then decreasing and then increasing again the population has enabled greater and greater state interference into private life and a focus on the intimate details of women's personal lives and women's bodies. All right, thank you.
Hi, everyone. So with Sarah's introduction of the historical background, I want to continue and zoom in to what Chinese urban women are doing today. Where is this thing? Okay, can people see this?
Looks good.
Okay, excellent. So I want to share with you some background on the subject we're discussing. And I have exactly 8 slides. I think we can get through in 10 minutes. Fast forward to 2015. This is the latest time we have numbers on urban women's marriage. And the postponement or even giving up marriage is happening very fast among urban women. And you see, I think on your left, the bar is for women aged 20 to 24 who are single, meaning never married. And in 1990, that's about 40%. And by 2015, it's more than 85%. And the fastest change is happening among age group 25, 29, these late 20s. And also the change was between 2000 and 2010, the rapid change. So we're looking at more than 1 in 3 women now in their late 20s who are still single, and these are 2015 number. And given how fast this has been going through, I think with the 2020 census, which we don't have the detailed data yet, we should be able to see changes possibly similar to what has happened in China's neighbors, Japan, and then South Korea. So in China in 2015, about 10% of urban women were still single in the early 30s. And that's up from less than 2% back in 1990, 5 times increase. And that's about the number of South Korea in year 2000. So South Korea had 11% of women who were never married back in 2000. And then in 10 years, that rose to nearly 30%. So we are still waiting to see with the 2020 census how fast this has been moving. But clearly, in terms of late marriage, the changes have been quite drastic. So what's behind these changes? We're seeing as the same time as marriage age has increased, and also a number of historical changes in China, which I think we can discuss today, including the changes in education, higher education especially, and norms in gender equality, marriage and a family, and importantly, also in addition to gender inequality, the economic inequality and high cost of living. Now here, you may have noticed the graphs are from Shanghai in the People's Park. Saturdays, they have this marriage market. And then to the right, my right, is the picture I took in Beijing during the Miaohui, during Chinese New Year, the first month. And all the posters advertising for marriage, these are parents who are worried about their daughters not getting married. So all the ads we saw, we saw, are for girls. Here are two examples of the concerned mothers for their girls, right? But to understand why marriage has changed so much, I think we can look at educational change. We're seeing a great transformation. So here, the orange or the red line is for the enrollment ratio for females. So it's the share of women who are in college age, who are in college. And the blue line is for males, for men. And not even going back to the 1970s or 80s, just look at 1994 here. In 1994, the enrollment ratio for women in college was only less than 2.5%. So it's really, really very small proportion. And this is the sex ratio, the male to female, female to male. This is like, we're talking about only half of, in terms of college entrance enrollment, only half of, well, women's share was only half of men's share. So it was really a very typical low enrollment and a sex ratio that's tilted toward men. And look at what has happened. So by 2020, the enrollment ratio went up to over 60% for females and over 50% for males. And in 2008, a great reversal took place. That is similar to Japan and to South Korea. The number of women, female students enrolled in college surpassed that of male students. And in the last few years, the ratio is 20% more female students. So this is happening, and which has a direct effect on women's marriage. We're going to see this later on in terms of labor force participation as well. Marriage is a social outcome. So here we can see how there are two patterns here. One is how in 2015, the marriage, actually the proportion of not married goes up with education. So married, more educated men and women marry later. But also for men and for women, they will have different patterns. So for males, if we look at the low education, the lowest level, almost 2 to 1. So it's clearly not having education is a punishment for males. But if you look at sex ratio here, this is males to females, and we see opposite pattern, which is for women with more education, higher education, the share of never married is higher. So we have the social stratification in marriage, and the pattern works in different ways for males versus females. What's happening in the society along with increased expansion in higher education is also the change we see in gender norms. And this is from Lang Lian, a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology, who analyzed the data from the Chinese General Social Surveys. And these two both show the gender attitudes towards work and priority, whether to give this to men or versus women, and also whether marriage is important in having a more important than having a good career for women. And in the early years of the 2010s, both these are people, sorry, agree with the statements, and they have both, the share have both declined. Another piece of data we can see on changing marriage and gender attitudes is what do men and women expect in a marriage partner. So these are from surveys we did in Shanghai with Fudan University, asking the only child generation, young men and women, what they look for in a marriage partner. So the red lines are, the red bars are for women, and then the darker black bars are for men. And in almost every trait, we asked the respondents, with the exception of appearance, where men rated more important than women, women expect more. So young women expect more in a marriage in every other criteria. And both for young men and women, the most important criteria right now are personality, good living habits, and the intelligence. So this is what young people are looking for in a marriage. I think that provides some hints on why people are postponing marriage or even giving up marriage. So the last two slides I want to show, with the higher education expansion, we see how labor force participation rate dropped among young ages for women. However, the labor force participation in general is still very high in China. So women are, most women, almost all women are still economically active, doing all sorts of works, manufacturing, service, and in other managerial positions as well. So why is this important? Because this is the last slide I will share with you. These are the number of hours women work at home, spend on housework in 3 different societies. Urban China here at the lower right, and Japan and South Korea. For urban China, the number of hours, these blue bars, show that these are from time surveys, declined somewhat, especially by 2011. But the share women, wives do in the household, in housework, has hardly changed. If anything, it increased slightly, about 40%. Okay, so women spend not only hours working, but for married women, they also spend many hours and many more than their spouses at home. Now, we don't have time to look more into late marriage or singlehood in Japan and in South Korea, but we see the same thing. That is, the number of hours women spent doing housework has not decreased, and the share of women's contribution to housework, these are the lines. In Japan, it increased, but only 5%. And in South Korea, in Japan, it's about 20%, and South Korea is also only about 20%. So I think that gave some hints on not just in South Korea, in Japan, but also in urban China, of why women are postponing their marriages. So I'll end here, and then we can have discussions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Those presentations were very informative and also quite complimentary. And I'm thinking that before we open it up to audience Q&A, maybe I can just kick off the discussion with a few questions of my own. But if you and the audience have any questions for Sarah or Wang Feng, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and I will read them on your behalf. So maybe to just get started, I mean, the one-child policy was in effect for over 30 years. Most demographers tend to think about it as having a pretty disastrous record. It was coercive, it violated women's bodies. Many people argue that China's population would have naturally flattened out without it. So given these concerns, why do you think a three-child policy is being put into effect right now? And do you think that this three-child policy is actually going to work?
I think Wang Feng should take the first question and I should take the second question.
Well, I think there are many reasons. The short answer is no, it's not going to work. And the reason, one of them is one of the ironies we have seen is in the last 40 years, in terms of the economy, it's and other aspects of the society, it's been more open and liberalized. But in the thinking of population, this control mentality has persisted. And population has been always treated as a commodity, as a product, as a number that can be planned. So unfortunately, that was one of the driving thoughts behind the one-child policy, that they could just simply slash the number to do magic with the economy. And now they, unfortunately, I think the same mentality persists. That is how they can just simply by changing the policy, they can change the number. So the thinking is quite outdated, and it's quite, I would say, inhumane, not treating people like people, but just numbers.
Yeah, I would add to that. So the kind of historical moment that the one-child policy came out of, it was sort of generally accepted among demographers, if I can say that, that there was a belief that policy could really influence population change. And this was a kind of an idea that was shared by a lot of Western demographers, and an idea that was adopted in lots of different foreign contexts. But I would say that the kind of belief that you can socially engineer the population largely went out of style, but China has held on to that anyway. For example, we could say, take a look at the fact that eugenics in most American circles is not something you would openly admit to supporting, but eugenics are actively promoted on billboards and on signs and things like that. And so to speak to Wang Feng's point about the lack of people, there's a lack of humanity in the approach to human beings. So it's sort of like, if you just add something here, our outcome will change, but people are people. And so as to the question of whether I think a three-child policy will work, absolutely not. I don't think it will work, because the systematic, the factors in place that brought us to the particular moment we're at now have not changed, regardless of the policy, until there's support for women, until there's better, less expensive education, things like that, until women are not required to do so much housework, until all of these social changes take place, there's no incentive for couples to have more children, especially women.
And actually, if I can add to Sarah's observations, so the one-child policy was really misguided based on a really a very poor understanding of why fertility was declining or why fertility declined. It's the same, I think, the outdated and lack of understanding of what's happening in China, just like the numbers I just showed. If you look at what's happening with education, how this is happening among young women, and look at work, look at housework, and without looking into other issues, which I think we have time to discuss, you'll see that this is not what's happening in China. It's not something you can just change the policy and you can reverse this demographic change.
We have a bunch of questions coming in the Q&A, but I think I'll just maybe ask one more before I start reading off the audience questions. So, I mean, we've been focusing both on demographic policies, but this webinar is also focused on gender. So one thing that I'm curious about, and maybe both of you can speak to this from different perspectives, is why the Chinese state has focused so much of its attention on women specifically and women's bodies when it's attempting to address these demographic concerns. Where are the men in all of this? Why the focus on women?
So Sarah, you would take this up first.
Okay. So if you read my book when it comes out, one of the arguments that I make is that this focus on women's bodies and this kind of singular concern with monitoring women's bodies is not a new thing, but it's something that we can actually date at least to the early 20th century. So the legal framework has always emphasized what women are doing. So it's completely in line with what's been going on historically to kind of ignore men's role in reproduction and focus solely on women as the biological mothers. I would also say men's resistance hasn't really helped either, and I think it's sort of, I don't know if it's universal, but sterilization is not, I don't think, is a widely liked thing among any type of people, but in particular when the government tried to enact policies that were a little more egalitarian by having a focus on male sterilization versus just female sterilization, and which is one of the kind of most common forms of birth control from the 80s and 90s, men were highly resistant to it for a wide variety of reasons. So the state, I think, works in concert with kind of patriarchal attitudes to perpetuate that focus on women.
Yeah, I think what we can see now is, I don't know what's the equivalent to the phrase, you vote with your feet. So we are seeing that during the earlier coercive birth control campaigns, women could be dragged to operation tables to have forced induced abortion and mass number of sterilizations, IUD insertions, and women really paid with their bodies. And China is different now, right? We're looking at the higher education college enrollment ratio of over 60%, and women are educated, and you can force people to not to have children by sterilization or abortion, but I don't know how the state can force women today to get married and to have children. So women are voting with their marriage license. I don't know. So in any case, but also I think we'll come back to think about this. I would say why are women are always the targets for demographic issues is because men are making the decisions. And this is especially the case in China. look at 7 people who line up on the podium, who are the most powerful people in China, and the same thing with the 20-some Politburo members, only 1 woman. So I think with that, we should entertain questions, right?
Sure, yes. So the first question comes from our UCI colleague, Gustavo Oliveira, who's in the Department of Global and International Studies. And he's curious about this category of urban. This webinar is titled Urban Women in China's Demographic Crisis. And so he asks, is the data that you've presented for all women in China or only urban women? And what exactly do we mean by urban women anyway? Is it just women with an urban hukou, a residence permit, women who live and work in urban areas, but who've maybe migrated from rural areas? And how might our analysis change depending on how we define what constitutes urban?
Can I take that question, Sarah? Okay, so great question. We actually have 3 definitions. So the one, the urban we used, for instance, in the chart I used for 2015, it's for city, and it's for it's by residence. So there are 3 definitions for urban in China. One is by the residence, and the other is by your hukou status. And the third one, I think it's important, which is not people would generally use, is by employment. Okay, so by 2020, China has about 2021, over 60% of the population are classified as urban by residents. And but by hukou status, by non-agricultural hukou status, it's about only 40%. So we're talking about 20% difference. And by employment, over 70% of young people are in non-agricultural professions. So this is quite important. One, I think we're really looking at China as a largely industrialized society with over 70% of young people working in non-farming jobs. And the other one is also quite important. The difference between residential urban and hukou urban, the household registration status, we're looking at 200 million, over 200 million migrants. So a lot of the young people who are migrants in cities, and think about the cost of living, think about the life they have. And this actually has a direct impact on these women's private or men's private lives, marriages, and that's a huge segment of the population.
I don't really have anything to add to that.
That's fine. We have lots of questions, so we can continue to entertain audience questions. I think that was very comprehensive. This is maybe a kind of asking you to predict the future a little bit, setting up a sort of dystopian Margaret Atwood type situation. But this is a question from Chris Ding, and he is talking about how in October of 2021, the Hunan provincial government started to advocate for urban women to leave behind their jobs in cities and go back into the rural areas to get married and have children. And he's curious if you think that at the national level, will the Chinese Communist Party start implementing laws or policies that will encourage more women to do the same, to give up their jobs and to just go back to their natal villages and get married and have children? What do you think? I mean, it's probably difficult to predict, but given your knowledge of this topic.
Sarah, go ahead.
Well, if I take a stab at it, I can't imagine that being something like an overt message that the state is sending. Like it's not going to ban women from working in urban workplaces, I'd imagine. But I can see there's if the government kind of participated in affirming these like subtle forms of discrimination that do force women out less overtly, for example, not standing up for women's rights in the like Me Too movement, or not taking salary differentials seriously, or things like that.
Wangfeng, do you have anything to add, or should we move on?
Well, again, as what I said in the to the earlier question, the answer to the earlier question, it's I think the government could force people not to have children, but I don't see how they can force people to have children, even they send them to space, right? So and sending them back to the countryside, and also it's not so simple. What about their livelihood, right? Actually, we're talking about a China that's going to need a lot more young workers and young labor. And we all know agriculture, put more people in farmland, it's going to reduce productivity, not increase productivity. So that's totally contradictory to where the economy is moving. So I mean, there are a lot of crazy ideas, but this is probably, I would say, it's one of them.
So I'll ask one question that's more targeted toward Wangfeng, and then my next one will be more targeted to Sarah. So Wangfeng, you pointed out that Chinese women are postponing or giving up marriage altogether. And this audience member is curious if you have information about the change of the share of out-of-wedlock births over time in China. Do you have any sense of if there are more children being born out of wedlock now, or has this been relatively stable?
Excellent question. We don't have numbers, but I can tell you with a lot of confidence, the number is very small. And actually, it's a fascinating factor in a funny way. That is, it's because out of wedlock birth is still quite a taboo, not just in China, but also in South Korea and in Japan. And as a result, because women don't want to have children, therefore they don't get married. And so this is what we've been observing for South Korea, for Japan as well. Fertility is so low is it's because out of wedlock childbearing it's so trivial, so rare. And this is not just a simple taboo. It's also a sense of parenthood. There are studies saying that both in Japan and in South Korea, parents actually feel very strongly if they were to raise a child, they should have a family, they should have a marriage. And so that's why we have this non-marriage and low fertility tied together, right? And unlike in some Western European countries or in the United States, where you have a large share of, significant share of birth out of wedlock, so that's not the case, and that is why people are not getting married, and you have this low fertility, right?
Sarah, this question comes from our department chair, Heidi Tinsman, and actually two questions that she asks. One is she's curious about the impact of global feminist movements on birth control and marriage in China. You had gestured a little bit in your presentation toward Margaret Sanger, but maybe you could elaborate on that. And as a follow-up to that question, she's also curious about whether it's becoming more difficult for women in China to get an abortion or other forms of contraception or birth control today.
Okay, to address the first question about global feminist movements, I mean, if we're thinking back to the like the 1920s and 1930s, China was definitely part of the global conversation, not only about eugenics, but also about free love, about women's rights, about women's liberation. And so those things I definitely played a critical role in determining the initial course of the Communist Party, so the initial commitments that the Communist Party made. It would later go back on a lot of those promises, but it's only, I would say, born out of this larger global feminist movement that those issues even came to the fore in the first place. Let me find the other question. Right, so this so-called Marxist emphasis on emancipation, on women holding up half the sky, that's all a part of this kind of global conversation and this global Marxist conversation. But as we see from looking at history, that quickly that conversation dies down when it's no longer useful for the Communist Party to mobilize women, when pursuing women's rights at the expense of men's rights is no longer politically expedient. As to your other question,
it was on the topic of whether access to abortion is becoming more restrictive in China today.
So I haven't been to China since 2019, so I can't speak to this exactly. But what I do know, thinking a little bit also about the question that Wang Feng was just answering, in my research, I found that time and again, young women who became pregnant out of wedlock would say that it's much more shameful to give birth out of wedlock than to just have an abortion. Like if you go home and tell your mom, sorry, I got pregnant and I had an abortion, she'll be mad, but it's not like a life-threatening thing. However, if a young woman gets pregnant and doesn't abort, it can really ruin her life socially and economically and lots of different other ways. So I'm not sure exactly how, if it's getting more difficult, but I think with the new legislation restricting non-medical abortions, that reminds me of actually in 1935, when in 1935 the the nationalist government said that medical abortions would be allowed, and that was considered to be an innovation to let women who were very sick have abortions. So now we're going backward all the way to the Republican period, back to early 20th century policies, where that was still an innovation, allowing women who were sick to have an abortion.
Yeah, it kind of remains to be seen how this new policy about the Chinese Communist Party seeking to restrict access to abortions for non-medical purposes is going to play out, or how widely it's going to be enforced. So this is a question that has to do with education, sex education in school. Jessica Bissett is curious what young women and men are learning in school about sex. Is birth control a topic that they learn about? Is the message that they're receiving that men and women need to get married in order to have children? So do you have any sense of what sex education is like in China today?
Sarah?
I can speak to that. So remarkably, a lot of the sex education messaging in China today is very similar to what it was in the 80s, which is also very similar to what it was in the 50s. And it's mostly abstinence education. I conducted a number of interviews with people of different ages about what constitutes sex education and to what extent were they exposed to it. And some people said, oh, we have sex education in school. We took biology, but that's not, I mean, that's gonna give you some basic knowledge, but it's not going to give you, it's very rudimentary. And today, studies show that today it's the rate of young people understanding the mechanics of sex beyond like pornography is very, very low, strikingly low. While urban young people tend to be exposed to slightly higher rates of sex education, it's still kind of surprisingly low, and it remains to be seen what could actually be done to remedy that, because the state is increasingly emphasizing sex education, but it's it's clearly not a priority, or it would have been, more efforts would have been made to promote it already.
So Sarah, you're saying that all these Hollywood movies and everyone has a cell phone, smartphone they can watch. In China, they have not gotten much sex education from those Western movies.
So it would seem. It's funny though, because some of the political rhetoric is that STDs and violence against women and things like that are imported issues. And so you would think with all of the importing, they would also, birth control might also be imported. But the conversation about sex and sexual hygiene and things like that is very much restricted to married people still. And so there's just a fundamental, there's a gap in education for people who are young and sexually active but not married.
Yeah, actually, I want to add a footnote to an earlier exchange on making abortion less accessible. Sarah, you did the study, from the 1950s, early 1950s, when abortion was made legal. It has always been that way for the last more than 5 decades. So for the government to reverse this, even in a very subtle way, it would take a lot of effort, to reverse something that is almost like a Chinese culture for the last, 5 to 6 decades, right? So it would not be easy, right?
So I think we'll have time for maybe just one more question. This question is probably more tailored to Wang Feng, as it talks about data sets, which is not something that I know Sarah tends to work with. So this is a question from our colleague Samantha Vortherms, and she's curious about kind of breaking down some of the data that you presented. So she asks, thinking of the patterns today, are there regional differences subnationally in terms of marriage rates? For example, would we expect the trends to be driven by women in top-tier cities, or conversely, would we expect more dynamic growth in second-tier cities? And then as a kind of related question, she's curious about how migrant women factor into this urban-rural divide. Should we expect migrant women to more resemble urban women or rural women when it comes to marriage and childbirth?
Let me take up the second question first. There are a lot of studies of social behavior, especially with reproduction across different countries. The migrant behavior in general resembles the destination locations. So I would say the migrant behavior would resemble more of the cities, in the cities when they are in the cities. And that's one of the reasons why they migrate. It's not just economic opportunities, but also lifestyles. And but that's not absolute. But in general, that's what we would expect. Now, in terms of regional differences, definitely. Places like Shanghai and in large cities, you would see, I would not be surprised that you will see the proportion of unmarried in very late in the 30s would resemble already what we see in South Korea and in Japan. And in lower tier cities, the behavior, the pattern we see would be different. And we're going to have data from the newly conducted census, so we should be able to see that. But there's an important issue that I think we want to bring back to. The title today is Urban Women and China's Demographic Crisis. It's such a title because we like to link the two, not we, but everybody, the pundits, as Emily said at the beginning. But what China faces is not a demographic crisis. It's really an underlying social crisis. And if there is a crisis, it's the changes in inequality. So that gets back to the question of migrants. Think about migrants in cities. Think about the cost of living. Think about how hard it is for them to acquire housing and to maintain a stable job. And so given how Chinese young parents, more educated, they are mindful of their responsibility for the children. And those kind of uncertainties among migrants, to get to the question, I think it's really a disincentive for them to get married and to have a family. So I think the migrants, the unresolved issue of incomplete urbanization in China is one of the inequality forces that's creating what do we see in the so-called demographic crisis.
Great. Well, we are just about out of time right now. Once again, I would like to thank our brilliant panelists, Sarah Mellors Rodriguez and Wang Feng, for their really informative presentations. And thanks to all of you for tuning in and asking some really wonderful questions. I hope to see you at our next event. And until then, please do take care.
Thank you.
Evening or afternoon.
Thank you.